Well, I held my excitement for You Season 4 about as well as Kate and Joe disposing of a body.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Yes, America's favorite toxic stalker is taking on Europe, and I've never been more excited.
You are wrong. My dick's never been softer.
Joe, please, my mom watches these videos.
I was ready to piss on your face to prove I'm enough for you.
Hey, stop! Why?
You Season 4 Part 1 is a wild whodunit, and in this video we'll be going over the killer, what to expect in Part 2, and how Joe's class assignments hint at where the story could be going. And you'll want to stick around to the end of the video, as I have a theory that's going to blow your mind that Rhys Montrose isn't who we think he is. Now, as of the time of this writing, I've only seen episodes 1 to 5, so any of my theories involving Part 2 are just that. I've also left timestamps below to the topics I'll be covering if you want to skip ahead. That being said, I will be covering Part 2, so make sure you're subscribed so you're notified as soon as that comes out. In order to understand how the Eat the Rich killer came into Joe's orbit, we have to examine how Joe Goldberg became Professor Jonathan Moore. This is really important as it ties into what might happen in Part 2. At the end of Season 3, Joe successfully framed love for several of the murders in Madre Linda, faked his own death, and left his son Henry with the charming gay couple. He'll call leaving his son the hardest thing he's ever done. However, over the course of the next 5 episodes, he rarely, if ever, mentions him. I wouldn't be surprised if Joe cares more about his obsession, Marienne, than he does about his own son. As I'll prove later on, Joe wants to become a better person and redeem himself, not for the sake of his son, but to win Marienne back. The last we saw of Joe, he was hanging out in Paris. He knew that's where Marienne was likely headed after the events of Season 3, so he stalked every artist haunt in the country, knowing she was an artist, in search of her, ultimately finding one of her paintings, which led him to an art show in England. Joe is so blind to the fact that Marienne thinks he's a crazy person, he chases her down and vows to prove to her that she's wrong about him.
You're wrong about me. You know what? I'm gonna prove it to you.
I think this is the most important line in the first 5 episodes. It's Joe's motivation for the entire season, to prove to Marienne that he isn't the monster she makes him out to be. And to her surprise, he lets her go. This is where Joe begins his transformation into Jonathan Moore. While stalking Marienne, Joe is approached by a man named Elliot Tannenberg, essentially a hitman hired by Love Quinn's father to track Joe down and kill him. But lucky for Joe, Elliot is tired of the hitman business and offers a solution that may be beneficial for both him and Joe. If Joe promises to keep a low profile, he'll give him a new alias, a new chance at life. Elliot gets to keep the money, Joe gets to keep his life, and Love's father can sleep knowing his daughter's murderer is 6 feet under. It's win-win.
Jonathan could be your chance too, to make some different choices.
But there's one catch. Marienne knows Joe is still alive, thus Joe is tasked with killing her to tie up this loose end. But as we find out in the show, he doesn't go through with it, instead stealing her locket to prove to Elliot he finished the job. In fact, he keeps this locket with him even when he started his new life. He's still obsessed with her, whether he admits it or not. As I'll get to in my Part 2 theory section, I don't think we're done with Marienne just yet. So Joe takes up this new alias of Jonathan Moore, a man whose background allows Joe to get any job he wants. And what better job for Joe than a literature professor? It's his job that puts him in close contact with Malcolm, the Eat the Rich killer's first victim. By the end of episode 5, we learn the Eat the Rich killer's identity, a man who might be the next mayor of London, Rhys Montrose. We first meet him in episode 1, where Joe finds him the only one he can stomach at a socialite party held at Adam Pratt's Sundry House. The first clue he's the killer is that he's the only one in this elite group who knew the pain of growing up in a society that looked down on the poor. Everyone in this friend group is downright ghastly when it comes to treating the disenfranchised. In fact, Adam here has a fetish where he can only get off if servants piss on him. Rhys, unlike the others who were born with a silver spoon, grew up in extreme poverty and was raised by an unstable single mother. His life was a mess until he found out he was the son of a duke, went to Oxford where he met these fine folks, and went on to write his critically acclaimed memoir, A Good Man in a Cruel World, which we can see here in the promotional material, as well as a book Nadia enjoys. In episode 2, Nadia states that all motives in a whodunit boil down to 3 things.
2. All motives always boil down to sex, money,
or revenge.
So it appears Reese falls into the revenge category, wanting to get back for his shit childhood. His friends don't even care that the common folk are struggling.
They're dancing while the world burns.
It's after Reese leaves his conversation that A, Joe loses his phone, and B, appears increasingly intoxicated, although it's left up to the viewer whether or not he was slipped something or just drank too much. While Reese had his phone, he installed an app called Evanesce, which allowed him to communicate with Joe anonymously. Now, it's also possible that Reese has a network of accomplices aiding him in his plan, but I'm not 100% sold on this theory just yet. It would, after all, explain how Reese, who's supposed to be an extremely busy man, is in so many places at a time. Maybe it was one of his accomplices who drugged Joe, took his phone, or dropped Malcolm's ring in his jacket in episode 3. What about Gemma's death in episode 4? Did Reese kill her, then just hide for several hours until he reveals himself later on? There's just a lot of weird stuff here that isn't adding up. We get some more clues with the murder of Simon Sue. Check out the murderer's pants. They're the same as the waiters catering the event, and definitely not what Reese was wearing. Now, it's also possible he took one of these uniforms to commit the murder. The murderer wore black shoes while the catering staff all wore white. Reese also wears black shoes, but it's too difficult to confirm if they're a match. In episode 5, we'll see him donning these leather gloves, which may also be the same leather gloves used to kill Simon. I just wanted to throw this theory out there for you to keep in mind while watching part 2. Reese is also the only character that we, the viewer, sees give a eulogy at Simon's funeral. And when he starts talking about hiding our true identities under masks, I had red flags going off like crazy.
But we all wear different masks, depending. And of course, parts of us we can't bear to show to anyone.
It isn't until episode 5 that Reese reveals himself as the Eat the Rich killer, having to save Joe from being killed by a drug-fueled Rold. But this leaves so many questions. Why taunt Joe? Why simultaneously try to frame him for murder, only to save him from death and moments later burn him alive beneath the halls of Borehall Blacksworth? I think this has something to do with Edgar Allan Poe's The Man of the Crowd, a short story that is brought up in Joe's class in episode 3. It tells of a narrator who follows a man throughout crowded London, slowly becoming obsessed with him, making up his own theories of what this man has done and who he is. In this metaphor, Reese is the narrator and Joe is the old man. Reese, like the narrator in the story, follows Joe around and makes assumptions about his character. This leads to him becoming more and more obsessed, later digging into his past, as we see with these articles that he leaves pinned to his wall. And part of this obsession stems from Reese believing Joe is like him, the feeling that he's found someone and is no longer alone. In fact, the epigraph of The Man of the Crowd states, quote, "This great misfortune of not being able to be alone." Both Reese and Joe can't stand being alone. They share a similar upbringing, they're both killers and both compulsively obsessive. Reese wants to join with Joe as partners in a quote-unquote project, just like Joe wants to be partners with those he obsesses over. So when Reese comes back and finds Joe hasn't killed Rold like he asked, he thinks he's gotten Joe all wrong. He lights the place on fire, and if Joe should survive, they can revisit this topic in London. Expect this in part 2. Now, I have two absolutely insane theories I want to throw out there. What if Reese is Joe's half-brother, Jakey? The last we saw of Jakey was when he was a little boy with Joe's mentally unstable mother. It's bonkers, but could be a really fun twist if the writers pull it off. Second, what if Reese is one of the forgotten children of Borehall Blacksworth, making him a relative of Phoebe? When he reveals himself to Joe, he tells him he's done research on the Borehall Blacksworth, stating,
You'll find family members who disappeared, children who, well, they didn't fit the decor.
What if Reese was one of these children? It would give him an even deeper personal motivation for getting back at the rich, and Phoebe and her friends in particular. All these theories hinge on the ambiguity of Reese's upbringing, leaving lots of opportunity to further flesh out his character. But doesn't he have a memoir that outlines his childhood? Well, he told Joe that parts of his book were a lie, so we can't take anything in his memoir at face value. This leads to theories for part 2. Again, I have not seen the episodes, so feel free to laugh at me when I'm proven completely wrong. Reese obviously has a much bigger plan here. As he launches his candidacy for Mayor of London, he states that he'll be a champion of the poor. But this position may also help him cover up even greater crimes and give him access to more and more influential people. If episodes 1 to 5 were finding out who the killer was, expect episodes 6 to 10 to revolve around Joe stopping him. But I think the biggest thing part 2 will delve into is this idea of redemption. Can Joe prove to Marienne that he is redeemed? In episode 1, Joe has his Joe's class read Ted Chiang's Hell is the Absence of God, a story about a man desperately trying to get into heaven to reunite with his love. Joe is desperately trying to reunite with Marienne but can't, in his mind, unless he achieves this redemption, much like the character in Chiang's work. Later in episode 1, Joe will ask Reese if he thinks redemption is possible.
I think yes. As long as they commit to never run from themselves. Face it all no matter what.
But how does one achieve redemption?
Chiang isn't actually saying the highest redemption is doing good. He's saying it's just love.
A truly selfless act for love may be what is required for Joe to achieve this redemption. Just how that ties into stopping Reese and potentially proving to Marienne she's wrong about him remains to be seen. Another big wild card here is Kate's father, Tom Lockwood, apparently one of the world's richest and powerful men. I can't help but feel there's more to this. Hell, even though the man's been estranged from his daughter since she was 20, he still pays for round-the-clock security for her, although it's ambiguous whether this is for her safety or to keep tabs on her. Having this evil capitalist and Reese who hates the elite, I can't help but think they'll come into conflict. Now, I've outlined a bunch of wild theories and what we might expect for part 2, but what do you think? I want to hear all your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Be sure to drop a like, and for more bad takes, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at ThinkStoryYT. Until next time, remember,
You are wrong. My dick's never been softer.